one of the most terrifying statistics I ever came across was one detailing out the rationale of the United States Armed Forces for not allowing you can't induct anyone into the armed forces in the U.S. if they have an IQ of less than 83. Okay, so let's just take that apart for a minute because it's a horrifying thing. So the U.S. Armed Forces has been in the forefront of intelligence research since World War I because they were on board early with the idea that, especially during wartime when you're ramping up quickly, that you need to sort people effectively and essentially without prejudice so that you can build up the officer corps so you don't lose the damn war. Okay, so there's real motivation to get it right? Because it's a life and death issue. So they used IQ. They did a lot of the early psychometric work on IQ. Okay, so that's the first thing. They're motivated to find an accurate predictor, so they settled on IQ. The second thing was the United States Armed Forces is also really motivated to get people into the armed forces, peacetime or wartime. Wartime, well, for obvious reasons. Peacetime because, well, first of all, you've got to keep the armed forces going. And second, you can use the armed forces during peacetime as a way of taking people out of the underclass and moving them up into the working class or the middle class, right? You can use it as a training mechanism. And so and left and right can agree on that. It's a reasonable way of promoting social mobility. So again, the armed forces, even in peacetime, is very motivated to get as many people in as they possibly can. And it's difficult as well. It's not that easy to recruit people, so you don't want to throw people out if you don't have to. So what's the upshot of all that? Well, after 100 years, essentially, of careful statistical analysis, the armed forces concluded that if you had an IQ of 83 or less, there wasn't anything you could possibly be trained to do in the military at any level of the organization that wasn't positively counterproductive. Okay, you think, well, so what? 83, okay. Yeah, 1 in 10. 1 in 10. That's 1 in 10 people. And what that really means, that as far as I can tell, is if you imagine that the military is approximately as complex as the broader society, which I think is a reasonable proposition, then there's no place in our cognitively complex society for 1 in 10 people. So what are we going to do about that? The answer is no one knows. You say, well, shovel money down the hierarchy. It's like, the problem isn't lack of money. I mean, sometimes that's the problem, but the problem is rarely absolute poverty. It's rarely that. It is sometimes, but rarely. It's not that easy to move money down the hierarchy. So, first of all, it's not that easy to manage money. So, it's a vicious problem, man. And so,
it's hard to train people to become creative, adaptive, problem solvers.
It's impossible. You can't do it. You can't do it. You can interfere with their cognitive ability, but you can't do that. Its training doesn't work.
It's not going to work in 6 months, but it could work in 6 years.
No, it doesn't work. Sorry, it doesn't work. Like, the data on that's crystal clear as well.
I mean, there was a time when being a few standard deviations above the mean in intelligence didn't get you very much when you're just plowing the field alongside your neighbors. But now you can start a software company or a hedge fund. Okay, and this leads to astonishing levels of wealth inequality and cultural isolation. This is a theme that Murray has returned to in his other work, and in a more recent book, Coming Apart, which we also discuss. Now, unfortunately for Murray, what we have here is a set of nested taboos. Human intelligence itself is a taboo topic. People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter, because they're highly predictive of differential success in life. And not just for things like educational attainment and wealth, but for things like out-of-wedlock birth and mortality. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and that there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups. Now, for better or worse, these are all facts. In fact, there is almost nothing in psychological science for which there is more evidence than these claims. About IQ, about the validity of testing for it, about its importance in the real world. about its heritability, and about its differential expression in different populations. Again, this is what a dispassionate look at decades of research suggests. Whatever the difference in average IQ is across groups, you know nothing about a person's intelligence on the basis of his or her skin color. That is just a fact. There is much more variance among individuals in any racial group than there is between groups. So, besides being unethical and politically imprudent, it is totally irrational to treat people as anything other than individuals. Murray and Herrnstein were absolutely clear about this in the bell curve. So, what happened to Murray, as far as I can tell, has had nothing to do with errors of scholarship, of which undoubtedly there must be some, or for the way he's conducted himself since, or for his personal motives for discussing these topics in the first place. Rather, his scapegoating has been entirely the result of his having merely discussed differences in human intelligence at all. Now, it's certainly true that the definitions of both intelligence and race are open for debate, to some degree. And there can be cultural influences in the concepts we use that we don't totally understand. But the efforts to invalidate the very notions of general intelligence and race have been wholly unconvincing from a psychometric and biological point of view, and are obviously motivated by a political discomfort in talking about these things, on points about which there is virtually no scientific controversy.
Look, I've read once, and it's a very good point, that freedom breeds inequality, because you're free to put as much effort as you'd like into something, and you're going to get unequal results. And that if you are truly free in a free world, some people are going to do far better than others, and just based on their own input, just based on their effort, just based on the amount of focus and dedication they have. It is very unequal. You know, I know many people that are far more dedicated than other people that I know, and they do better.
Yeah, well, that's well buttressed by the empirical literature. Because,
Yes.
well, I mentioned earlier that the two best predictors of long-term success are intelligence and conscientiousness. And what intelligence is probably something like the number of credible operations that you can manifest in a given period of time. It's something like speed. Now, it's not only that, but speed's a big part of it. So if what you're doing is working and you can do it faster, that works better. Okay, that's pretty damn straightforward. And the next thing is, well, conscientiousness. Well, conscientiousness would be something like how many of those cycles of effort are devoted to that specific task. And it turns out that if there's a relationship between the effort and task success, more effort is better. And so I can give you some indication of the power of that. So if you have good measures of conscientiousness and IQ, you can predict someone's success in a competitive landscape with a correlation of about 0.6. And what that would mean is, imagine that you tried to pick people, you just said randomly you're going to be a success in the top half of the successful people, say, and you're going to be in the bottom half. You'd have a 50% chance of making that selection correctly if you did it randomly. If you did it informed by the results of a good cognitive test and a conscientious test, you'd be right 85% of the time. So you could say with 85% accuracy, which of two people would be more likely to be in the top 50%. So it's a whopping effect, and it's actually some validation for the essential integrity of our system, because we hope, given that it's essentially an open meritocracy, that smarter, hardworking people would do better, and they do. Now, other factors apply. Corruption, for example.
Lots of factors apply. I mean, for one thing, wrapped up in IQ is a big question, which is how much of the differences in IQ that exist is democratizable. That is to say, how much of this is the result of environments that aren't enriching, or there's lead in the water, or who knows what.
Yep. Not enough vitamins.
Right. My sense, actually, my intuition based on what I know biologically is that a huge fraction, maybe all of it, but a huge fraction of differences in IQ is actually could be generalized, and that's part of equal opportunity. It's not an equal opportunity.
See, I'm way more pessimistic about that, and that's partly because, I mean, maybe because I spent a lot of, because I'm interested in the amelioration of differences, you know. So, for example, that's why I built this future authoring program. It's like, hey, if we can figure out how to make people more effective, well, let's do it. So I scoured the literature on IQ enhancement, and it's bloody dismal, man.
Well,
it's rough. It's very, very difficult to put together a cognitive training program. Like, some things have worked in a major way. Like the fact that people aren't starving has moved the bottom of the IQ distribution way up over the last 100 years. That's been like a walloping success. But a lot of the things that we hoped would work, like Head Start's a good example of that. You know, Head Start was part of the American War on Poverty, and the idea was you'd give, you know, deprived kids a leg up early before they hit school, and start training them cognitively earlier. And the hope was that you'd get a Pareto thing going where they'd be a little smarter in kindergarten, and then they'd do a little better in grade 1, and that would make them do even more better in grade 2, do better in grade 2. But what happened was that the kids who went through Head Start actually did get a cognitive jump on their competitors, but all the other kids caught up by grade 6. And by grade 6, there was absolutely no effect whatsoever of the training program left. Now, Head Start did have a couple of benefits. One was fewer teenage pregnancies and fewer dropouts. But that was probably because the kids who got into Head Start were either socialized better, or that some fraction of them were removed for some time from extremely toxic environments just while they happened to be at Head Start. But it didn't produce the cognitive improvements that everyone, right and left, were equally hoping for.
Yeah, but this is in some sense, it's a very much an uncontrolled experiment, right?
Absolutely.
Because A, Head Start starts late.
Yep.
And B, it doesn't insulate you from all of the stuff that comes along with growing up in the deprived neighborhood. And so,
absolutely.
Anyway,
and also,
we really don't know what the truth is of human IQ. And there are some results that suggest some things that are not hopeful. On the other hand, some of them just simply run afoul with the biological realities of intelligence.
Well, here's a good example of the lack of malleability. I mean, there's a couple of things. The first is that we may already be at a point of diminishing returns in terms of eliminating individual differences in IQ, because everyone has central heating, everyone has air conditioning, everyone has enough food, everyone has access to an infinite pool of information. So you could say even if you're in a deprived environment but you're smart, the intellectual landscape is wide open to you. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but you can make a case for that. But the more dismal end of the biological research on IQ shows things like, if you take identical twins at birth and you put them in adopted out families, that the IQ of the adopted out twins is much closer, A, to the original biological parents than to the adoptive parents, and B, almost perfectly correlated with one another, and that correlation increases as the separated twins age. So let's say you had a twin, you were both adopted out at birth. We test your IQs at 4. They're fairly close. They're closer to your biological parents than your adoptive parents. But then we test you every year until you're 60. By the time you're 60, no matter how long you've been separated as an identical twin, your IQ score is so much like your twin's IQ score that it's as if the same person was being tested twice. And that's a really complicated one, because you think, well, as twins travel through the environment and accrue different experiences, their IQs should diverge. Like, obviously. That's not what happens. They converge.
So there are a lot of places to critique that. For one thing, there aren't very many identical twins raised apart. It's a small sample.
This is definitely true.
Those identical twins raised apart carry with them whatever effects there were from before they were born, for example.
Sure, and they look the same.
And so if they've been damaged by an environment that was unhealthy for their mother when she was pregnant, then they would carry that through, and it would show up as a similar IQ later in life. So that one really wants to see that this is true on the positive side, not just the negative side. So anyway, I'm not saying that there's nothing to it. I'm really saying I think we don't know. It's very early in this. But what I can say, and I think, a couple of the things that we've settled on in this conversation already, are that an environment in which we can say anything, that we can advance any argument and test it. It doesn't mean that that argument is protected, but that any argument can be advanced and then challenged, that is inherent to navigating. And the other thing that I think we would agree on is that equality of opportunity is nothing but good.
Right, a fair game with equality of opportunity.
A fair game with equality of opportunity. And I guess one thing I would add, I don't know if we would agree on this, but you were talking about the fact that, I forget which thing exactly, but that a system based on merit produces inequality because people will
Freedom.
yeah, that freedom produces inequality. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't mean that we are obligated to ride it all the way down, right? The fact is we could make people safe to fail, right? So that you are encouraged to attempt to do something highly valuable. And if it doesn't work out, then the point is you're not home.